Apologize to my mother right now, or I want you out of this house tonight. My husband's voice hit the Thanksgiving dinner table like a fist, sharp enough to stop every conversation at once. 14 people went still. The candles kept flickering. The turkey sat half-carved at the center of the table, and my mother-in-law leaned slowly back in her chair, crossing her arms, pulling her lips into a smile she didn't even try to hide. Everyone in that room expected me to fold. They'd seen it before, me swallowing whatever was rising in my throat, excusing myself to the kitchen, coming back 5 minutes later with tight eyes and a fixed smile like nothing had happened. That was the routine. That was who I had been for 6 years of marriage. What my husband didn't know was that the woman sitting across from him at that table was not the same woman he'd kissed on the cheek that morning. 3 hours before I'd lit those candles and set out the good dishes, I was crouched on the floor of his home office with documents spread around me that made me feel like the ground had simply opened up. I hadn't said a word about what I'd found. I had folded the papers neatly back into the envelope, walked upstairs, finished seasoning the turkey, and waited. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to follow along until the very end. And drop a comment, letting me know what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. My name is Joanna. I'm 32 years old, and for 6 years I have been married to a man who genuinely believed that loving his mother and loving me were the same kind of love. They were never even close to the same thing. I grew up outside of Winnipeg, in a town small enough that everyone knew your grandmother's maiden name. I came to Toronto for university, stayed for work, fell in love with the city the way you only can when you've earned it, and eventually fell in love with Greg at a friend's housewarming party in Leslieville on a warm night in late May. He was funny in a low-key way, confident without being loud about it. I was 26 and I thought I'd found my person. I knew fairly early on that his mother was going to be a challenge. Roberta had been the gravitational center of her family for so long that the idea of sharing Greg's orbit felt genuinely foreign to her. She was 61, recently widowed, and she had arranged her entire sense of self around being the woman everyone deferred to. She wore that role like it had been custom-made for her. She never insulted me directly, I'll give her that much. She was far too careful for that. It was always a comment buried inside a compliment, a concern disguised as affection. That's such an interesting career for someone your age. Greg has always been so devoted, even when things get complicated. I just hope you two are being realistic about the future. Small cuts. Never deep enough to bleed in front of witnesses. Greg noticed none of it. Or he noticed and chose not to. By year 3, I had stopped pointing it out, because every conversation ended the same way. Me feeling like I was the difficult one, and him reminding me that she'd been through a lot and just needed more time. She never came around. Canadian Thanksgiving falls on the second Monday of October, the way it always does, and that year we were hosting dinner at our place in East York, a semi-detached on a quiet street that we'd bought jointly 4 years earlier, both our names on the deed, both our savings pooled for the down payment. I made the entire meal. Turkey, stuffing with wild rice and dried cranberry, roasted squash with maple and thyme, and 2 pies from scratch because my grandmother always said 1 pie at a holiday table was an apology, not a celebration. Greg's contribution was opening 2 bottles of Niagara Pinot Noir and accepting compliments on the wine selection. His mother arrived 90 minutes early and immediately began rearranging the table settings. I let it go. She made a comment about the pie crusts looking rustic, in the tone people use when they mean rough. I let that go too. She spent nearly 20 minutes talking to Greg's cousin about how devoted Greg was, what a patient man he was, how lucky he was to have a wife who was at least trying. Greg sat right there and said nothing. The dinner itself started well enough. But as the evening stretched on and the wine kept coming, my mother-in-law got looser with her remarks. When I mentioned a major project I'd been promoted to lead at work, I'm a financial analyst, and this file had been months of careful, detailed work. She tilted her head and said warmly, "That's wonderful, dear. Don't you find that kind of pressure exhausting, though? Greg, doesn't she seem run down lately?" And then she looked at him and smiled, like she was doing me a favor by worrying. I smiled. I poured myself more water. I said nothing. Then, near the end of the meal, she reached across the table for the gravy boat, caught the edge of the centerpiece with her elbow, a hand-painted ceramic pumpkin. My grandmother had brought home from a trip to Quebec City in 1987, the last trip she took before she got sick, and sent it over the edge of the table. It hit the hardwood floor and cracked clean down the middle. She glanced down at it, then up at me, and gave a small shrug. "Oh, these things happen. You really shouldn't leave fragile things out when you're hosting this many people." Something inside me came loose. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't reach for anything. I said quietly and clearly, "I would appreciate it if you'd be more careful with things that matter to me." That was the whole sentence. Greg's chair scraped back so hard. It startled the people sitting nearest to him. His face had gone a particular shade of red that I used to mistake for passion, and had eventually learned to recognize as something else entirely. "Apologize to my mother right now," he said, "or I want you out of this house tonight." The room went silent. My mother-in-law's smile widened just slightly. And something inside me went very quiet. Not the quiet of someone who has been frightened into silence. The quiet of someone who already knows exactly how this ends. 3 hours before that dinner, I had gone into Greg's home office looking for our mortgage renewal paperwork. Our 5-year term was coming up in November, and I'd been meaning to pull the file to compare lenders before the rates shifted again. Greg kept his documents in a locked cabinet, but I knew where the key was. A small brass key on a hook behind his desktop monitor that he seemed to think I'd never noticed. I let him think that. I wasn't looking for anything except the mortgage folder. I found it eventually, tucked toward the back of the second drawer. But sitting underneath it was a manila envelope, unsealed, that I hadn't seen before. I almost put it back without opening it. Instead, I pulled out the papers inside and sat down on the hardwood floor of his office, because my legs decided that was going to happen regardless of what I wanted. They were printed TFSA transfer confirmations, 3 of them dated across the previous 14 months at irregular intervals. If you're not familiar with a TFSA, a tax-free savings account is one of the most widely used personal investment accounts in Canada. It's entirely individual. The money inside it belongs to you alone. A spouse cannot access it, withdraw from it, or authorize transfers from it without your explicit written consent. That's not just bank policy, that's law. My signature appeared on all 3 authorizations. My name, my handwriting. Except that I had never once signed them, never seen them before, and had not been aware they existed until I was sitting on the floor of my own home office, holding them in my hands. I sat there for a long time. Then I kept reading. Folded inside the back of the envelope was a printed screenshot of a text conversation between my husband and his mother. The thread ran back 8 months. The first message in the chain, hers, read, "She keeps that TFSA topped up every single year. She won't notice a partial withdrawal if it comes out in stages. I can help you with the signature. I still have the blank authorization forms from when your father was managing his accounts." 6 messages later, my husband had written back, "Are you sure about this? I don't want it coming back on us." Her reply, "It won't. She trusts you completely. That's always been her problem." The total across all 3 transfers was $52,000. I had opened that TFSA account 9 years earlier, depositing a little each year, maxing my contribution room whenever I could, building something that was entirely mine. In 14 months, it had been quietly drained in stages, and the money moved into a joint account held between my husband and his mother. From there, it had been used as a down payment on a small farmhouse property near Picton in Prince Edward County. The deed was registered under both their names. A little investment, one of the texts called it. Something to leave the grandchildren eventually. The grandchildren that had never been discussed with me. The investment made with money I had taken 9 years to save. I sat on that floor until my heartbeat slowed, until the wave of grief and nausea and rage that moved through me like cold water had passed through completely, and what was left underneath was something steadier and colder than any of it. Clarity. I photographed every page with my phone. I put the documents back exactly as I had found them. I locked the cabinet and hung the key behind the monitor and went upstairs to finish making dinner. So when my husband stood at the head of that Thanksgiving table, his arm extended toward the front door, and his mother's smile grew just a little wider in anticipation of my surrender, I wasn't afraid. I was certain in the particular way you can only be certain when you know things that the people across from you don't know you know. I pushed my chair back from the table. The room held its breath. My husband straightened, clearly reading my movement as capitulation. My mother-in-law unfolded her arms, preparing to receive her apology. I did not walk toward the front door. I walked around the mahogany dining table, slowly, each step deliberate and unhurried, and stopped beside my mother-in-law's chair. She tilted her head up to look at me. Her expression was still settled into that familiar confidence, but something shifted in her eyes when I didn't look away. I leaned down until I was close enough to keep my voice private. I know about the $52,000 you had Greg transfer out of my TFSA, I said. I kept my voice completely even. I have the transfer confirmations. I have the printed text thread. I know about the Picton property, and I know your name is on that deed right alongside his. I straightened up and looked down at her. The change in her face was immediate and total. Every trace of color drained away. Her hand shot out and gripped the edge of the table like she needed something solid to hold on to. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Joanna. My husband's voice from the far end of the table was unrecognizable, thin and uncertain in a way I had never heard from him before. What are you saying? Ask her, I said. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan, where I had been carrying a folded set of photocopied pages since I came downstairs to start dinner, and I walked to the center of the table and placed them down on the white linen. Those are copies of the TFSA transfer authorizations, I said, clearly enough for everyone at the table to hear. My signatures on all 3 documents, none of them signed by me. Your mother had access to the blank authorization forms. She helped produce the forgery. I looked at my husband then, and I let him see that my hands were not shaking. The original documents are in your filing cabinet. My attorney has reviewed photographs of all of them. The table came apart. Greg's cousin stood up so quickly her chair tipped. My brother-in-law, Greg's older brother, who had been quiet all evening at the far end of the table, leaned forward and pulled the photocopies toward him. I watched his jaw tighten as he read. Greg. His voice was controlled and very low. What is this? My husband was no longer looking at me. He was looking at his mother, and for the first time in 6 years I watched the certainty drop off him completely, like something that had just been waiting for the right moment to let go. Mum, he said, tell me this isn't. Tell me there's an explanation for this. My mother-in-law had pressed her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were filling. Whatever composure she had spent 60 years building had come apart in under 3 minutes at a dinner table in East York on a Monday night in October. You should also know, I continued, that I reached my attorney by phone this afternoon and sent her copies of everything before our guests arrived. Financial fraud involving a forged TFSA authorization is a serious matter under federal law. Forgery of a financial instrument is addressed under the Criminal Code of Canada. She is reviewing both. Joanna, we can sit down and talk through this, Greg started. You gave me one option about 20 minutes ago, I said. I'm giving you the same courtesy, with slightly different terms. I would like you and your mother to collect whatever you need for tonight and leave my home within the next 30 minutes. Anything remaining after that point can be arranged through our respective lawyers. I paused. If you're still on the property when the half hour is up, I'll be calling the non-emergency line. They did not stay for 30 minutes. My mother-in-law had her coat and her handbag and was moving toward the front door in under 10 minutes, operating on the stunned efficiency of someone running entirely on shock. She did not look at me once. Greg followed behind her, carrying nothing except his car keys and whatever was left of his composure, which was not much. My brother-in-law caught my eye across the emptying room as the front door opened. He gave me a single slow nod. I nodded back. I stood in the hallway and watched them walk out into the October rain. It had started while we were at the table, the kind of cold October rain that comes in from the lake and settles in for the night. Greg stopped at the end of the front path and turned around. "We can fix this," he said. The rain was already darkening the shoulders of his jacket. "Joanna, we can still talk about this." I closed the front door. What followed moved faster than I had expected. My attorney filed a formal complaint within 48 hours of that dinner. The forged signatures on the TFSA transfer documents triggered a separate investigation by the financial institution, which froze the joint account Greg and his mother had been using to hold the funds. The Prince Edward County property was flagged as part of the proceedings and could not be sold or refinanced while the matter was active. My mother-in-law retained a criminal defense attorney within the week. My husband retained a divorce lawyer the same day. My brother-in-law called me 4 days after Thanksgiving. He said he didn't have adequate words for what he felt and that he wanted me to know he was genuinely sorry, not just for what had happened, but for the years he hadn't been paying close enough attention. He said he'd always known his mother was difficult, but he hadn't understood how far it had gone. I told him I appreciated him calling. I told him the most useful thing he could do was simply tell the truth if anyone asked him what he had seen at that table. He did exactly that, in a written statement to my attorney that proved more useful than either of us had anticipated. The civil recovery took 7 months. My attorney negotiated the return of the full $52,000 plus accrued interest, plus a damages settlement that covered my legal costs entirely. The Picton farmhouse was sold to fund the repayment. My mother-in-law avoided criminal prosecution in exchange for full financial restitution and a signed statement confirming that the transfer authorizations bore forged signatures. A document that became the foundation of my divorce proceedings and made the financial settlement straightforward. My husband called my phone 14 times in the first month. I let every call go to voicemail and forwarded them to my attorney. Eventually, the calls stopped. The divorce was finalized 8 months after Thanksgiving. I kept my name, my career, my savings account, my fully restored TFSA, and my grandmother's ceramic pumpkin, which I had taken to a restoration specialist in the distillery district while the legal proceedings were still ongoing. She worked on it for 2 weeks. The crack is still faintly visible along one side if you know where to look. I think I like it better this way. Some things that have been broken don't need to pretend otherwise. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I accepted a remote position with a wealth management firm based in Vancouver and moved to Victoria, British Columbia, on a gray Tuesday in June that turned warm and bright by early afternoon. I found a small apartment on the south end of the city, second floor, with windows that faced the water and the Olympic Mountains beyond the strait. On clear mornings, I could see the peaks, pale and precise against the sky. On foggy mornings, I could see nothing past the water at all, and I liked those mornings just as much. I drank my coffee and watched the ferries cross and felt, for the first time in years, like I was breathing at full capacity. Within a year, I had built up enough of my own client base to leave the firm and open an independent financial consulting practice. Small, deliberately so, built from scratch on my own terms. I work primarily with women in their 30s and 40s who are navigating significant life transitions, divorce settlements, inherited assets, starting over after a long relationship that cost them more than they understood at the time. I know what it feels like to have your financial security eroded quietly by someone who relied on your trust to do it. I know how to help people find solid footing again. It turns out that knowledge is worth something. I still have a copy of those printed text messages in a folder in my filing cabinet. Not because I need them. The case is closed. The money is back. The chapter is finished. I keep them as a reminder of what it costs to extend unlimited trust without looking carefully at who is holding it, and what it is worth, in the end, to finally trust yourself completely. Sometimes I think about that Thanksgiving dinner, the table full of people, the rain coming in off the lake, my husband pointing at the front door like he was certain he had already won. I think about standing up from that chair and choosing, very deliberately, not to walk where he was pointing. Choosing instead to walk toward her, the particular look on her face. In the moment she understood that I had known for 3 hours and had said nothing, had served the meal and poured the water, and smiled and waited, and that the woman she had spent 6 years deciding was too trusting to look behind the curtain had been standing right in front of her the entire time. My husband told me to apologize and leave his house. I walked over to his mother instead and said the one quiet sentence that dissolved everything she thought she'd built. The life I have now, the water view, the morning coffee, the practice I built with my own hands, the particular piece of knowing that every single thing in it is genuinely mine, all of it began in that moment. Not when he screamed at me, but when I chose to stand up slowly instead of crumbling, and to walk toward rather than away. What would you have done sitting at that table? Tell me in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, hit subscribe. There's always another chapter worth telling.